of open seminars these days, due to the well-known circumstances, online seminars where alumni of the Aleksanteri Institute Visiting Fellows Program present their research on Russia, Eurasia, and Central and Eastern Europe through the lenses of broad range of disciplines and methodologies and topics ranging from large societal, political, and cultural questions to micro-level analysis in the present and past times. And today's talk, we're delighted to have Professor Margarita Balmaceda, who will actually talk about her brand new book. And first of all, my congratulations on this. So this is a fantastic and great achievements, and I'm sure all of us are looking forward to reading the full version. I had a chance to read only the first chapter, but I'm looking forward to the rest. And without any further ado, let me introduce our speakers and discussant. Margarita Balmaceda is Professor of Diplomacy and International Relations at Seton Hall University, United States. Concurrently, she heads the study group on energy materiality, infrastructure, spatiality, and power at the Hansewissenschaftskolleg, Germany. And she's currently on sabbatical. We're all dreaming about this, as Petro Yatsyk Distinguished Fellow in Ukrainian Studies at the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Margarita's research analyzes the connections between natural resources, international relationships, and political development with a special expertise in energy politics, oil, natural gas, coal, nuclear, renewables, as well as steel and the metallurgical sector in Ukraine, the former USSR, and the European Union. And her books, before the one we are going to talk about and discuss today, actually include The Politics of Energy Dependency, Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania between domestic oligarchs and Russian pressure. In 2013, then another book, Living the High Life in Minsk, Russian Energy Rents, Domestic Populism in Belarus, the Impending Crisis, 2014, and Energy Dependency, Politics and Corruption in the Former Soviet Union, 2008. So Margarita Balmaceda has conducted an extensive research in Ukraine, Russia, Belarus, Lithuania, Moldova, Hungary, and Germany, and was in residence at the Aleksanteri Institute as a visiting fellow back in February, June 2009, and as Marie Curie Fellow 2010, 2011. And I was one of those young students back then who were just looking at big scholars. So that's why I remember Margarita as being at the Institute. So, and today I'm very glad that we have a chance to discuss her brand new book, Russian Energy Chains, The Remaking of Technopolitics from Siberia to Ukraine to the European Union, which actually I think it was supposed to be published in April, and it means that it's already out. So it's out here by Columbia University Press. So, and I also would like to share the discount flyer, which you can find in the chat if you're interested in purchasing the book. So this is 20% discount, so which sounds like a good deal. And you can also find the link to the publisher's site to the book, where you can actually see the content and other details. And I would also like to introduce our discussant, Professor Veli-Pekka Tynkkynen, a professor of Russian Environmental Studies at the Aleksanteri Institute and Helsinki Institute of Sustainability Science here at the University of Helsinki. And he's also holds a title of docent at the National Defense University in the field of Russia's energy and natural resource policy. So before that, he was a professor in Russian energy policy at the Aleksanteri Institute. He's also an adjunct professor in environmental planning at the Department of Geosciences and Geography, also at the University of Helsinki. And his research fields are energy, environmental policies, energy security, natural resources, political, societal power, and culture in Russia. And let me also advertise our professor who belongs to the Aleksanteri Institute. So the most recent Veli-Pekka's book was published in 2019, and it's called The Energy of Russia, Hydrocarbon Culture and Climate Change. So I'm really looking forward to the discussion and exchange of ideas between the presenter and the discussant. So, and you can also, yeah, it's our promotion. It's a link to Veli-Pekka's book. So I hope you will enjoy the discussion. So, and Margarita, the screen is yours because we have no floor. So
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And I would like to start by simply saying that I cannot imagine a higher pleasure than sharing my new book with my fellow former alumni of the Aleksanteri Institute. You cannot imagine how much the Aleksanteri Institute has meant for me. My 2 stays there as a visiting fellow, later as Marie Curie fellow, and in particular for this project. Although I did not conduct the actual research for this project at the Aleksanteri Institute, I spent a very intense period of planning and dreaming and thinking about this project at Aleksanteri. And I cannot imagine how this research would have developed without me having the support and the impetus I received at Aleksanteri, both in the form of the enormous inspiration and support I received from your head of international relations, Anna Korhonen, in 2014, in developing a related project proposal related to this book. And since then, through the Finnish Center of Excellence on Russian Modernization, which allowed me to conduct a number of workshops where different ideas related to this project were presented and discussed, and most broadly through the belief in my work and the ideas that I had to share. I am tremendously thankful to Aleksanteri, and I will come back to this later on. So what I would like to do today is to tell you a little bit about this brand new book. It just came out last week. Unfortunately, I didn't have time to send or for a copy to get to Felipeca or to Margarita on time because it just came out on May 11. But I want to tell you a little bit about this book, and I hope we can have a discussion about how some of the themes that are developed in this book relate to current debates and current challenges in energy policy in the former Soviet Union and in particular in Ukraine. This is a big book. It's about 500 pages. I spent 7 years or 6 years writing it. There's no way I can encapsulate everything that the book deals with in half an hour. I just want to touch upon a couple of themes or mainly one theme in the book as a motivation for discussion. And then perhaps at some other time we can discuss some of the concrete theoretical and factual elements of the book. So of course I have a PowerPoint. I'm going to share it with you, and that may help us to focus on a couple of the key points that I will be making. And please bear with me because I'm not very good at technology. Okay, am I sharing? Excellent. Very good. So what I'd like to do today is in discussing this book, I would like to basically divide my time in 3 parts. First, I want to talk about the prehistory of this book. Some of you are familiar with this because you know me and you know my previous work, but I want to give you a little bit of a sense of what led me here. As a professor, I have the luxury of being very slow, and I am very slow because what took me to this book is like 20 years of research on 3 other books, and eventually I came into the ideas that led to this book, and I'm sure this will also continue in equally slow manner in the future with other ideas and other books, and that's the beauty of being able to let research and discovery guide you. So I'd like to talk a little bit about what led me here. Secondly, I'd like to tell you a little bit about some of the key issues that I try to discuss in the book, in particular, the one that forms the title of my presentation, Threat and Temptation. And then I'd like to look at the future, kind of what does this mean in terms of the future, and in particular, the future of Ukraine in the European energy space. So what is the prehistory of this? Well, if you know me, you perhaps know, or if you have discussed with me about energy, when I started working on energy, which was about 15, 20 years ago, I was very dissatisfied with the state of the literature at that time. in particular, a literature that seemed to focus only on the idea of energy as a weapon, Russian energy as a weapon. And again, I live in the United States, and the energy discussion in the US is very much, when dealing with Russia, very much focused on strategic elements and very much focused on analogies with oil. And I'll get to that in a moment. So I was not very happy about this. I was not very happy about this because this narrative treated energy as an undifferentiated whole. If you have lived in the US, you know that the way the Americans refer to petrol for their cars as gas. So gas, natural gas, oil, that all gets confused. And in the analysis, there was very little understanding on the difference between these different energy types. It's a narrative that doesn't treat technology seriously. And for me, as a Ukrainian studies specialist, one thing that especially bothered me was the fact that even when pretending to stand up for the rights of countries like Ukraine, actually this narrative reified the idea of energy consumers and energy dependent states in the former Soviet Union as victim entities with very little agency of their own. So that, I was not very happy with this. And what I try to do is I try to deal with this by saying, okay, let's look at that possible field of agency. Let's look at those energy dependent states. Let's look at what they can actually do or not do. And basically what that meant is that you would need to look at the black box of what happens between supply and actually the energy policies of these states. Very few people look at that because it's almost by definition a black hole. It's untransparent. To get any real information, you need to dig very deep into materials in different languages, into industry analysis. It's not fun, but I took it upon myself to do that. And the result of this were a series of books that basically dealt with different aspects of the black box. The issue of who is winning or losing from particular energy policies, what are the domestic governance issues that are involved. Can we even speak of energy policy when there is a situation where state companies, even state energy policy is hijacked? So these are all aspects of the black box. And in doing that, I ended up, I didn't expect this would be this way, but I ended up writing 3 books about this. The first one that came out in 2008, Energy Dependency, Politics, and Corruption, basically look at the question of, let's try to understand the possibility for energy policy in a country like Ukraine. And what is the real energy policy? And what I ended up discovering is that what we called energy policy actually was simply a byproduct of whatever balancing between interest groups was taking place in Ukraine in the context of a particular governance situation. Of course, all against the backdrop of very unique energy relations with Russia. So this book really digs in very much detail into every possible type of corruption you could imagine, and what does it mean in terms of energy policy. And as you see from the title, it really discovered there was a missing energy policy, which in itself is an energy policy. I also look at this question by comparing 3 post-Soviet states, which have been historically very dependent on Russian energy, from small to big, Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine. I actually finished this book while I was during my Marie Curie fellowship at Aleksanteri, so that was really amazing. It would have been impossible to finish this book had it not been for that stay at Aleksanteri, and had it not been for those very, very long spring and summer evenings in Helsinki, because I basically work from sunrise to sunset, which in May and June meant like 23 hours a day, and being at Aleksanteri, it was just a pleasure to do that. And in this book, I try to answer the question, well, how does the political system in different post-Soviet states affect what these states have actually done in terms of their energy relationship with Russia? How have they responded to that energy dependency? And what I found out was not only that their de facto political system, which is very different in Lithuania, Belarus, and Ukraine, affected how each of these states dealt with their energy dependency on Russia. But I also found out that once you start engaging in a particular way of managing your energy dependency, and once you engage in a particular, what I call circle of rents, that in turn comes to affect your political system. So it's a kind of feedback that I found very interesting. Also at Aleksanteri, I finished another book, which is related to the other country where I have done a lot of research, Belarus. And actually in this book, I engage with the issue of how energy policy, in this case, also including issues of discourses about energy policy, may actually allow a small energy dependent state to manipulate its larger, quote unquote, patron state in a way that allows certain authoritarian regimes and certain authoritarian dynamics to continue. I found this work on this book very interesting, because what I found out was absolutely counterintuitive. Not the idea of a small energy dependent state always following the policy of its patron, but actually using energy policies and discourses in a way that allowed it to also manipulate the patron state. So in all these books, I look at the domestic politics of energy dependency. And I'm confident that after writing these 3 books, I have a good grasp of it. But looking at that black box, which, as I mentioned before, had a lot to do with governance, had a lot to do with corruption, it unveiled really a very different narrative than the one we saw or we see in the traditional literature. Basically, for sure, it was not the narrative of victim states. It was not the narrative of entities without any agency. It was a narrative and a reality of actually very ambiguous attitudes toward engaging in that energy trade with Russia. Now, we know that those engaged in corruption had a lot to gain from energy dependency. I know that because I wrote an entire book about energy corruption in Ukraine, and we also see energy corruption in Lithuania and Belarus, and those engaged in energy corruption could benefit from energy dependency. We know that, I know that. But after I had finished those 3 books, I started to scratch my head, and I started to realize that actually that ambiguity, that ambiguous set of attitudes actually went beyond the issue of corruption. You don't have to look very far to find energy corruption, especially in the period 1991 to 2014. But what I found out, and only really came to realize after those 3 books have been published, is that there is something else. Even if there was no corruption directly, there was an ambiguity between the desire to diversify, the desire to become less dependent on Russia, and the desire to use participation in those relationships to maintain some leverage in the relationship with Russia, and to access profits, benefits, spillover rents from this relationship. And I'll get back to that in a moment. So what we see is that in all these cases, there is a tension between what we could call the pool goals of moving away from close dependency on Russian energy, and in particular Russian fossil fuels. But on the other hand, the push goals of trying to actually strengthen the role in the value-added chains of Russia's energy, to maintain leverage by perhaps balancing dependency on supplies with Russia's dependency on a particular state for transit or something else, and participating in those profits. So I'd like to move now to what I try to do in this book and the kind of issues that moved me to this book, and perhaps focus on one or two key elements there. So from that previous work, I understood that the relationship with Russia was not only about threat, not only about the fear of Russian energy, but also about temptation, temptation beyond corruption. Again, temptation through corruption is very real, but here we are talking about temptation beyond corruption. And what I understood is, to understand that, it's not enough to look just at the supply of energy. It's not even enough to look at the black box, like I spent 15 years looking at with those other 3 books. You actually need to look at the entire value chain of that energy, and in particular, the entire value chain of the Russian energy exports, to really understand that interplay. To do that, basically, when you're talking about the entire value chain, you are, in a nutshell, talking about the upstream, which is the actual energy production, the midstream, which may include transit, may include refining, may include processing, and the downstream of supply to end users. If you look at this map, you will see that roughly that also relates to 3 geographical areas, very often production in Russia, very often in Siberia, midstream in Central Europe, Eastern Europe, Ukraine in particular, and downstream in Western Europe. So I understood that you have to look at the entire chain, and to do that, what I do in this book is I take 3 very concrete chains, export chains and value chains, one for natural gas, here starting in Urengoy in Western Siberia and ending in Bavaria, one for oil, starting in Batyaganskoye and ending in Dresden, and one for coal, starting in the Bachatskaya mine and ending up actually also in Germany. These are exemplary chains. They are dozens or even thousands of chains that you could find that connect production in Russia with end consumers in the EU. The way I chose these chains was very painstaking. It was very, very hard to find these concrete chains. I wanted them all to go through Ukraine. I wanted them all to end in Germany, not anywhere in the EU, but in Germany, because even when the EU has a strong EU-level energy policy, state-level regulations are still very important, as we know from the latest news concerning Nord Stream, and I wanted them to end in Germany. So these are verifiable and verified chains. They're exemplary chains, and through them, through the travelogue of these 3 molecules, I tell the story of threat and temptation, but also the story of the impact of materiality on energy power. So what are the questions I try to answer in this book? Well, first, an empirical question. What has participation in those chains meant for the actors? How does it affect the way we look at power? Once we look at power not simply as supply, once we look at power not simply as power over someone, but as power that unfolds throughout the chain, well, what does it mean in terms of the power relationship? I also had a historical question. I'm moving here to the third part of the slide. How did this participation in those chains actually shape politics in post-Soviet societies? How that combination of facing the power of Russian energy as power over, combined with energy as power to create political actors in those states. And all of this relates to the question in the middle, which was perhaps the hardest to deal with, which is how do the differences in physical characteristics of different types of energy affect power relations? And basically, this takes us even to the molecular level and the differences in very sheer materiality of these different types of energy, and how do they affect what you can do with it? And that was kind of the theoretical question that I was trying to engage with in this book. Now, I have a very serious theoretical question, but this is not intended as a book only for bookworms or for international relations specialists. Using the device of the travelogue of the three molecules, I tried to bring a lot of information to the reader in a way that is easy to follow and easy to understand. So I like to say that this was a book that was very difficult to write, but hopefully very easy to read. So I am dealing with three types of fossil fuels, natural gas, oil, and coal, three areas. And I do talk a lot about technology. I will explain to you why, but I try to do it in a way that is understandable to people. And I also have a whole section at the end of the book where I go through each of the key technological processes or concepts, so that somebody who is using this in a college course, which I think would be very appropriate, can go back to that and see how that technology fits in. So let's look at this issue from the perspective of threat and temptation, which is the sliver of the discussion I'd like to focus on today. Threat and temptation, I know from the case of Ukraine, but it does not only relate to Ukraine. We know that countries such as Lithuania, which has been one of the former Soviet states that the most decisively tried to move away from dependency on Russian fossil fuels, even Lithuania had the desire to remain in those Russian energy chains. We know about the projects for an additional natural gas pipeline in the 2000s. We know how much there was an attempt or a desire to remain in the value chains of Russian oil through the Margarita naphtha refinery. We know of the case of Belarus, where participation in those Russian energy chains is actually what has kept the Lukashenko regime in power. And we know that that pull between threat and temptation is also very visible in EU states. We know about the tension between declared EU policy of diversification with the actual behavior and interests of EU energy firms. Look at the case of Nord Stream, look at the desire of important firms, including in Finland, Norway, and elsewhere, to participate in the energy chains of Russian exports through, for example, technology. So that is not only something we see in the case of Ukraine, but throughout the region. I do not deal with this directly in this book, but I do want to flag something which maybe Felipe-Pekka would like to touch upon when he's discussing in a few minutes. There is threat and temptation also in Russia. Felipe-Pekka does not use these terms in his book, but his book on hydrocarbon culture actually indirectly talks about this when he talks about the clash between what he even calls a violent fossil fuel-based political culture and a possible role as a renewables superpower. So again, this is not something I discuss explicitly in the book, but it's something for us to think about. How does that threat and temptation also manifest itself in the case of Russia, between the profits of fossil fuel exports and the reality of fossil fuels as something that is moving towards an energy system of the past. So maybe later we can discuss this in more detail. I would like to say a few words about the role of Ukraine in Soviet and Russian energy chains. When we talk about Ukraine's ability to use participation in those chains as counterweight to its dependency on Russia, we often talk about the fact that in the heyday, 10 years ago, Ukraine transited 80% of Russian natural gas exports. Ukraine transited more than 50% of Russian oil. We know about Ukraine's role in oil refining. What we sometimes neglect is the real importance of looking deeply at technology for understanding the role in those value chains. We know from this wonderful book by my colleague Per Hoxelius that Ukraine was actually very important as source of some of the first Soviet exports of natural gas to Western Europe and Central Europe. If we dig deeper and we look at the way natural gas behaves as a physical good, if we look at the way those methane molecules exist, we also know that managing pressure is key in any natural gas value chain. That's why my chapter on natural gas in this book is called Managing Pressure. And once you understand that, which is, it took me a little bit of time to learn about it, you understand that given that reality, Ukraine's role was key, because some key infrastructure located in Ukraine, in particular in Western Ukraine, from natural gas storage units to certain types of pipelines, was essential, not only for the Soviet Union to be able to export, and Russia later to be able to export at that during those months of the year where they would get the most profits, but also to keep the system in physical balance. So this is one example of how the materiality of particular energy goods affect how different players may play a role in these chains and relate to power. However, if the materiality of natural gas meant that Ukraine could play a key role in those exports, it also means that if Ukraine's broader countrywide natural gas supply system is not used at a high level of load, the entire system also is in danger of malfunctioning or collapsing. So again, this is an example of how understanding technology is really helpful to understand the power of different players. So very briefly, what kinds of threat and temptation do we see in the case of Ukraine? In the case of natural gas, which is the one we perhaps most often refer to when we talk about Russia's use of energy as a threat, we have on the one hand the threat of supply cutoffs, and of course we know that that threat has been discursively and mediatically used by both sides, because when you turn off the oil crane, it's something that you can use mediatically very well. So there is a threat, but there was also the temptation. Arbitrage gains from different prices, lower prices in Russia, lower prices for some consumers in Ukraine, higher prices for other consumers, higher prices in Western Europe, corrupt gains from this, transit fees, and very much in relation to the discussion of technology I just made reference to, you have the role of transit and of loading of your system in keeping your domestic system, your domestic grid viable, even at a purely technical level. We also see those elements of threat and temptation in the case of oil. The threat of a cutoff in supplies, the lack of alternatives, the dependency of your refining sector on those supplies, but also the temptation, the possibilities opened by transit fees, by the role of refining as a sector, and by transit supplies allowing a larger oil system to remain in place. If we look at the case of coal, we also see threat and temptation. I don't have time to talk in much detail about coal here. I would love to have a separate discussion about coal because it was really the most interesting part of my work on this book. Here you have a unique situation because coal is playing a role in two very important supply and value chains. The one that relates to steam coal that leads to electricity production, and the coking coal chain that is related to steel production. In the book, I follow the coking coal chain, and on the opportunity or temptation side, what you see is something that is very difficult to discuss in 20 seconds, but basically relates to the creation of an entire energy political system, not only in the Donetsk region of Ukraine, but in all of Ukraine, that allowed not only a sector to remain in place even when it was economically unviable, but that allowed the subsidies to that sector to be captured by certain actors, which in turn supported a certain way of doing politics, in particular that related to the Party of Regions and the Yanukovych period. All of these while the conceptual and the mediatic the conceptual and discursive use of coal miners, and the possibility of their participation in politics was used instrumentally by those very oligarchs that were benefiting from those subsidies. Again, we don't have time to talk about this here, but it's one of the most interesting findings from this book. So very briefly, I'd like to move and look at the future. What does thinking in terms of threat and temptation, what does looking at these chains ask us to think about when we look at the future? So very often when we talk about Russia's role, in particular for me as an Ukrainian expert and as somebody who is part of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute and of the North American Ukrainian Studies community, very often we talk about Nord Stream, the threat of Nord Stream, how Nord Stream is a threat to Ukraine and perhaps to European security. We sometimes talk about the blockade of the Azov Sea and of the Mariupol port by Russian vessels. I'm currently doing a project on the metallurgical industry in Mariupol and the connection with world markets. So I'm dealing with that. But what we often don't think about is how this relates to the issue of new spaces and geographies that are emerging in Europe. And here we need to think about Ukraine's role in that emerging energy space, but also at broader questions. And here we have to understand that when we, and I think this is obviously something Felipe-Pekka knows much more about than I do, we need to understand that geography is not simply, that space is not simply about geography. State is also about regulatory regimes. Regulatory regimes that regulate how that space is governed, but even how it is conceptualized. I simply want to flag that the way in which we traditionally have looked at energy space in Europe was co-created by the system of large-scale exports by the Soviet Union in the 1970s and 1980s. I also deal with this in particular in chapter 4 when I deal with natural gas, but that system of large-scale exports led to basically the creation of a governance system, of a regulatory system around natural gas, which has been in place until at least 2013. So the view of space is related to that, is affected to the role of the European Union as a regulation-making entity, and is related to its own policies, not always in sync, very often in tension and collusion between market liberalization, the desire for some degree of diversification, the goals of decarbonization, and also are shaped by the state of technology. So what we see now is a clash between different views of energy space in Europe. the old view, which is very, very much related to the framework that was co-created by large-scale Soviet exports of a route-based space, where you have specifically earmarked molecules moving from A to B, control points, and exacting transit, and a new view based not so much on a linear view of space, but a view based on hubs and anonymous molecules competing against each other. Why is this significant for our discussion? Why does it matter? It matters because if you start looking at space not so much as linear, if you start looking at space not so much as something intended to prevent competition between natural gas and natural gas, transit and the relationship between different players starts to look very different. And just as a little bit of a sense of what these two different views means in terms, on the left, you have the old view of space as something linear. In the second side, you have the view of a natural gas larger hub. And it means something in terms of our discussion, because if you look at energy, space, not as linear, your ability to benefit from those chains is very different, and you can no longer use that role of control point for that. What is interesting is that both Russia and Ukraine, even when they're so far apart in discussions about Nord Stream, they both are holding tight to that view. Because of the relationship with domestic political stability, because of the desire to triangulate, in the case of Ukraine, to triangulate with energy relations with the EU. But again, these are both based on that linear view of space, while we are moving towards a different view of energy space in Europe. And looking beyond Europe, we are moving towards a decarbonized future. We are moving towards perhaps electricity created in different ways as a common denominator. And we are looking at a future that hopefully will be more based on renewables, which creates totally new global chains. So I want to end here, and I simply want to flag those institutions that helped me with this project. For those of you who are now working on a PhD dissertation, for those of you who are starting a book, I know it can be daunting. When I started this project, I could barely believe that I would finish it, but actually I felt that same way with each of my previous projects. And what made a huge difference with this book, it still took 7 years to write, but what made a huge difference in keeping me focused on my goal was the institutions and the people who supported me. Knowing that somebody was expecting this book, having their support made all the difference. And I want you to know that, and I want you to know that you have tremendous potential partners in Helsinki, like I did, and I'm so happy to know that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Margarita, for a wonderful talk. I'm sure we have a lot of questions, and I actually would like to invite our audience to write your questions in the chat, or just not to forget to ask them, because now I'm giving the floor to Veli-Pekka for his comments, and I guess more questions are coming. Please, the floor is yours.
Yes, can you hear me? I hope you can. Yeah, thank you very much for this opportunity to comment and be a discussant for this excellent book produced by Margarita. And of course, I have to mention that when Margarita was working as a Marie Curie Fellow at Aleksanteri Institute back in 2010, she immediately took me under her wing. So I'm really grateful for her. Actually, she has been very much my mentor during these years, during the Marie Curie Fellowship already, but then especially during the Center of Excellence. Margarita really helped me forward also. And in that sense, for example, my book that just came out last year is very much also thanks to Margarita and her kind of very intelligible kind of good questions, always pushing me forward along my path. I have plenty of questions then, but unfortunately we have limited time, and I actually try to also grasp the kind of more the presentation, not the book itself, and touch those issues that Margarita also raised concerning, for example, the transition away from fossil-based energies towards renewables, and we'll touch that later on. But I would like to start by saying that, of course, this kind of new concept that Margarita is using in her book, this kind of energy as temptation, and I think it's a very excellent allegory in many respects. Of course, previously there have been other scholars using other names, like Per Högselius that Margarita mentioned in his book, Red Gas. He already used this kind of the concept of soft energy weapon, and what Margarita is doing in an excellent way has done in her book is kind of relates to this discussion. I partly agree with Margarita that yes, this discussion on the energy power, kind of this overemphasis on power over, this kind of black and white understanding of state energy power is something that we should problematize, and I think Margarita has done it well in her book. But actually, Margarita is arguing that kind of this energy as a weapon, that Russian state would be kind of pulling the trigger of an energy weapon, is something that we should problematize. And I think you do it well in your book, but at the same time, kind of your nuanced picture, how different interests in different energy sectors and how different actors play out, kind of adds to the interest that yes, we acknowledge and understand that, for example, Russian state is not controlling all the steps when it comes to energy leverage. It's not an omnipotent actor, but at the same time, actually, it brings to the fore that maybe Russian actors are much more aware than, for example, European consumers, and this is something that I discuss in my book, how these dependencies are actually being maintained for the benefit of Russia, precisely via these different different flows and different actors that actually Margarita is describing in great detail. And actually it kind of turns the focus back to state actors in that sense that I think the next step would be interesting to know how in the strategic thinking of energy policy, people formulating energy policy in Russia, formulating strategic stance towards future energy policies in the Eurasian space in general, how do they think about these kind of effects of change, chains and flows in general? And kind of this brings to the kind of to the empirical cases of Margarita's book that typically, yes, we look at energy leverage sector by sector, and actually this is what you're doing in your book. You're looking at oil, you're looking at gas, you're looking at coal, very interesting cases. But actually, my question would be that what can we learn about when focusing on the combined effect of these energy sectors? That, for example, how, from the kind of state perspective, again, how the combined effect of oil, gas, and coal, for example, has on individual countries, transit countries or end consumers, be it in your case, Ukraine or Germany. And I think this is a valuable question we should ask. And of course, the fact that you're focusing on coal and the double kind of role coal plays in electricity production, but also in steel, is extremely interesting. And then, of course, about the molecules, that's very interesting, also a kind of concept that you're introducing in your book. And it's a great way that you're unfolding the powerful kind of assemblages formed and maintained around these energy flows. And you're focusing on the molecules. And this kind of reminds me, you're focusing on Ukraine and Germany, but I'm interested, of course, also in the Finnish context. And one of the kind of good, interesting examples is, for example, Finnish oil refineries, or now one refinery that is using Russian oil, but not only Russian oil, but Russian gas. They kind of traverse and come together in a refinery that then sells actually most of its, or at least half of its products abroad, and is a very important node. and it's also related to this kind of molecular level materiality of energy, in that sense that it's a specific Urals sulfur-rich oil that we Finns have learned to utilize in the best possible way. Again, linking then to these kind of specific profits that these flows and chains produce. And what is kind of interesting, what you propose also, it's in the introduction, you write that what is kind of pivotal here is assessing and sharing of the profits along these commodity chains in Russia, in Ukraine, and in the EU, and in your case, in Germany. So it's not only through the value chains that you look at these profits and the power relations, but also throughout the value chain. And I think this is interesting because then it kind of expands the also geographical perspective of those energy flows. And this leads to kind of the question that you posed, that how does the world look when we move along the energy transition path? That in a way, this issue of kind of looking at these value chains and the profits throughout the value chain is, I think, interesting here. For example, this is related to the fact that when we focus on this word throughout, we are kind of becoming aware and also start to reveal what kind of different, for example, environmental emissions take place along the commodity chain. Then we are starting to becoming interested in, okay, how can we diminish those effects, those, for example, environmental effects along the commodity chain? And, for example, come up with certificates to curtail those environmental effects. And then that then leads to this question of profits throughout the value chain, because there are people who are actually in this present moment gaining profits of not including the environmental effects of production along the whole commodity chain into the final product. And this is related exactly to the fact that it is also very difficult in this kind of energy political, energy cultural context, not only concerning Russia, but actually the whole energy trade between EU and Russia, to promote renewables, because there are these kind of actors and parties who are benefiting from the fact that these kind of externalities are not being included in the price. And this is related very much to the kind of possibilities and also the kind of problems related to energy transition away from fossil dependence. And I think this is important question. And actually, a last kind of question, kind of even further, would be that in this kind of if you look at energy transition possibilities in this post-pandemic situation or ongoing pandemic situation, where we look at both the US and the EU are putting a lot of money, but also a lot of political muscles to all these investment programs. They are very much green. They are looking to hasten energy transition. They are looking forward to include carbon pricing and these kind of issues into the agenda. So if you look at your three chains of oil, gas, and coal that you focused in your case studies, how do they look like in this situation where EU's Green Deal or US green investments become a reality? Do they really kind of challenge those kind of paths that you described in your book? But I stop here because we're having only 20 minutes time to also for other questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Felipe. So I guess, Margarita, you would like to briefly respond to the comments and questions.
Yes. Well, Felipe, thank you so much for your support over all these years, for the tremendous inspiration that you have provided and feedback, not only at Aleksanteri, but in our study group in Germany. I think you have made two really interesting questions and points, which I cannot fully answer now, but that are going to provide a lot of thinking, food for thought for the future. First, your point about how the chains come together, country specifically in terms of specific transit countries or end consumer countries, that's a great point, great question. Am I able to get into the mind of the Russian strategists to see how they see this coming together? I'm not sure, but I think it's a very important point because it really kind of brings the circle back together. What does it mean for state policy? What does it mean for power over? And this makes me think about one of our colleagues from Bremen, Karen Smith-Stegen, who also was thinking about this. And I look forward to kind of working more on that. In general, I am a little bit skeptical about the idea of very conscious thinking about the end energy weapon, but I think it's something worth considering, especially when we had situations, for example, where in Ukraine, for example, the Russian ambassador was the former head of Gazprom. So that's that makes us think that obviously it does play a key role. Your second point about externalities, or your second question about externalities, is really, really key. And I have to say that that is something that is missing from the book. Absolutely. And if there is a second edition of the book where I can reframe and rework some things, I think I would need to look at that, because basically what you're saying is, when we are talking about profits, yes, it's very good to look at profits throughout the chain, but we cannot simply think about the visible profits. We need to look at the profits that are received by omission, that is by treating as externalities a lot of things that now, by treating as internal things that are now treated as externalities. And basically, that is, I would say, something that the book has not looked at, and I think something we need to pay much more attention. What are the profit and power implications of different ways, for example, of calculating the energy value of production, the caloric value of production in more narrow or broader ways, or the environmental impact in more narrow or broader ways? That's a brilliant point, and that is certainly something I need to think much more in the future. So certainly a lot of work to be done based on this, based on your comments, and I look forward to discussing that more in the future. If I may get back to you at with a question, how do you see, on the basis of your own work on hydrocarbon culture, how do you see that quote unquote temptation? How do you see those two sides happening in Russia, also from a cultural and discursive perspective?
That's an excellent question. And I think this is, if you look at I think it's a societal contract in Russia. And of course, we have to understand that there are state actors, there are energy companies who are building this kind of identity culture around fossil fuels. That's for sure. There's lots of research on that. But at the same time, it's surprising that how actually, if you look at the opposition of Russia, look at Navalny. Well, he's focusing on corruption, but still, if you look at the opposition, there's not really very many people talking about the future prospects of renewable energy in Russia as a political kind of counter strategy for the current economic policy that we see in Russia. And I think this is the key. This is kind of, there should be a kind of domestic, some kind of awakening in that sense, to understand that there are possibilities for Russia in the future. Because yes, the fact is that if Russia doesn't do anything in this respect for the next 20 years, it's going to be in trouble, because the rest of the world is moving ahead so fast with the energy transition. And that kind of leads back to these issues that you discuss in your book, the role of us consumers and transit countries, how we can actually, what is our role? Are we just thinking about energy flows from the border to our consumption and to the atmosphere from our societies? But are we able to think, as you try to kind of unfold in your book, that the fact that it is a value chain, and then if we understand it this way, as you describe in your book, that is one kind of step towards that situation where we understand, okay, we have to also be responsible about emissions in the upstream, and that is kind of related to the possibility of, because then there's an economic pressure also towards Russia to do something for these emissions, and that makes it possible for renewable energy industries to compete in the Russian domestic market, which is pivotal in kind of pushing forward this renewables industry in Russia. I think this is the path kind of forward.
Okay, so thank you so much. And now